Hello everyone and welcome back to yet another video. Today we are returning to a legendary quad-core, the one and only Intel Core i5-2500K. Part of the second generation of Core i processors, this 189 USD Sandy Bridge chip, introduced in early January of 2011, was manufactured on the 32nm process node. It featured 4 cores clocked at 3.3 GHz with no hyperthreading enabled. At stock, it happily boosts to 3.7 GHz on its own, but it was not long after where it gained much respect with its relatively easy overclocking potential. And this is where we come in. I mean, how is this chip holding up in 2022, and can it cope with modern games or even 4K? First, let's introduce the hardware used in today's testing. The motherboard is Asus P8-P67 Pro. There's 16GB of DDR3 memory, and CPU is obviously cooled by a Hyper 212 Evo. I've picked GTX 690 as the OG video card and a rather huge RTX 3080 acting as a modern day overkill. Before we get on with any overclocking, let's evaluate stock CPU performance first. Single thread performance in CPU-Z was 364 points, 1416 for multi-thread. In Cinebench R20, the stock i5 scored 976 points. This processor is well known to overclock like hell. I believe the IHS was actually soldered on, and unlike with the later generation of processors, this allowed for a lot more thermal headroom, and all you really needed was a P or Z chipset motherboard and not to use the provided stock cooler. The BIOS on this Asus board is super simple to navigate in. The only 3 things to change are the CPU ratio multiplier, in this case dial-in 45, meaning 4.5 GHz overclock, adjusting the V-core and also enabling the XMP for the system memory. Asus recommends to leave C1E and the rest of the states enabled, unlike with the previous generations, for improved stability. Let's save and check the results. CPU-Z first, and here, at 4.5 GHz, the single thread score was 446 points, that's a nice 22% increase. The multi-thread score was at 1702, or about 20% more. Cinebench R20 score jumped up to 1276 points, up by about 30%. Rather impressive, right? I'm thinking, let's add some more to the V-core and bump the overclock to 4.7 GHz. Finally, let's throw a simple graph and compare the scores from previous testing. At 4.7 GHz, the 2500K is about 27% faster in CPU-Z and about 36% faster in Cinebench R20 when compared to stock speeds. Looking at the older results, the overclocked but older i7-960 that we tested a few weeks back is marginally slower than a stock 2500K. The Q9550 is sadly left behind even further, but it's really nice to see how the performance grows with newer generation of processors. What do you think of the results? Moving away from CPU testing, let's run some games next, starting from the oldest. 2008 marked the release of the GTA 4, and we had a fair share of trouble with this title already, so how does it run with this setup? Well, at maxed out settings, GTX 690 did not see great usage on its cores, at times barely over 50%, and even lower with the 3080 at around 40%. I got logic-defying 74 FPS on average with the 3080 and just 4 FPS less on the GTX 690. The CPU usage was similar across both, only touch higher with the RTX card. Never mind, let's crank up the resolution up to 4K. The average FPS dropped to 67 and both CPU and GPU usage only saw few percent of increase. I don't think I will ever understand this engine, but let's move on. 2013's GTA 5 comes up next, and right off the start, what a difference. Here, we see excellent GPU usage in mid-90s for the GTX 690 and around 40% with the RTX 3080. The CPU usage was about the same with both cards. The 690 averaged 83 FPS and 3080 nearly 110 FPS. At 4K and with the highest setting but no advanced graphics enabled, the 3080 finally flexed its muscles. Check out the power usage at over 360 watts. Despite this, the CPU saw fluctuations around 80% usage and the average FPS was 58.5. 2015's Witcher 3 was another title where the GTX 690 scaled nicely and was used to nearly 100%. The RTX stayed in the usual spot at around mid-40s. CPU usage sits at around 80% and from time to time all 4 cores reach 100% with the 690. With the 3080 it's more consistent and even touch higher. The average FPS was 69.2 with the GTX 690 and just over 112 FPS for the RTX 3080.
A Witcher. Want to talk to him?
Yeah, and I want to plow the lovely Queen Cyril.
4K at ultra settings presented amazing visuals. 2500K was utilized greatly and at times pegged at 100% across all cores. The 3080 also saw full usage and power usage in excess of 370 watts at times, resulting in 101 FPS on average. Here's 2018's Red Dead Redemption 2, and with just 2GB of VRAM on the GTX 690, games simply refuse to apply any settings. One needs to visit and edit the configuration file. So anyway, here's what I think is everything on low settings. GTX 690 struggled with this game and CPU was not up to much either at around 50% usage. The RTX 3080 sat at its usual 40% usage but got the 2500K in high 90s, which was really nice to see. 690 achieved just under 28 FPS on average and 3080 pushed to 59. Cranking the settings to ultra dropped the average to 55.5. 4K and ultra settings pushed the 3080 to around 70% and the 2500K was nearly fully utilized. This game looks awesome at these settings and the average dropped to just over 40 FPS. ...2018's Forza Horizon 4 at medium settings kept the GTX 690 only half engaged and the CPU was hovering around 50% usage, while the 3080 again at around 40% and the 2500K was in high 90s. I have a sneaky suspicion there is a pattern to this. 690 pushed 41 FPS on average and the 3080 nearly 113. At ultra settings, FPS dropped slightly to 106. 4K kept the 2500K at nearly 100% usage at all times. The 3080 still had some to give, but what's interesting, the average FPS matched 1080p settings at 106. 2020 Cyberpunk and its built-in benchmark comes as last. Sadly, no SLI means half of the GTX 690 was just idling. We could really use its potential in this game. CPU was relatively cool at around 60% usage. The RTX 3080, as ever, saw around 40% usage, but the 2500K was really at it, with nearly 100% usage most of the time. At low settings, GTX 690 pushed nearly 25 FPS on average, and the RTX 3080 tripled this to nearly 75 FPS on average. This dropped to 67 with maxed out settings. Cranking the settings all the way up to ultra at 4K and not using any form of technology to help with performance, RTX 3080 was pushed nearly fully, however CPU usage dropped to around 70%. The average then was 41.5 FPS. And there you have it guys, let's summarize today's testing. I'm happy to conclude, for as long as a sufficient GPU is used, this platform still rocks. I've had no issues during my testing and really enjoyed the experience. The overclocking was fun, and it really showed how much more was inside of those chips if one decided to push it. My first gaming PC was Sandy Bridge based, and I kept it going until 7 years later when I finally upgraded to a 3900X. That says a lot. These CPU are easy to overclock, readily available and not too expensive. The bundle used in today's video cost me under £60 or about 70 USD. What's not to like? Well, there is USB 3.0 support, but that's about it. This platform aged significantly, being over a decade old. There is no support for modern PCI Express 3.0, and one needs to be aware of the SATA issues with the older revisions of P67 based motherboards. I'm looking forward seeing how does the results from today's testing stack up against newer processors, and also why not to throw an AMD chip in there for a bit of fun, right? Thanks for watching. Did you like this video? If so, please give it a like and also consider subscribing to my channel. I'd love to hear about your experience with this platform. Did you ever own a second gen chip? Did you manage to overclock it? Be sure to let me know in the comments down below. And as ever, I hope to see you all in the next one.